Welcome to the Digital Intellect, bringing you the latest news from around the world. It began with a tweet from President Donald Trump, a declaration of tariffs on Chinese goods, citing unfair trade and intellectual property theft. The date March 22, 2018, the target, China. To supporters, it was a bold stand for American workers. To critics, a reckless gamble with the global economy. China responded swiftly, imposing tariffs on American farm products, soybeans, pork, sorghum, hitting Trump's political base. Suddenly, Midwest farmers found themselves on the front lines of an economic war they never asked for. Families who'd worked the land for generations now faced losing everything. Small towns dependent on agriculture braced for impact as fear and uncertainty spread. The global trade system built over decades was shaken. Other nations saw opportunity. Brazil and Canada in particular prepared to fill the void. As American farmers watched their biggest market vanish, Canadian farmers ramped up production and signed new deals with China. The trade war, meant to make America great again, was creating new winners, especially America's neighbor to the north. This is the story of how a trade war reshaped the world, leaving scars on the American heartland and fortunes elsewhere. The world watched as two giants clashed, and the ripple effects were felt everywhere. For many, the consequences were immediate and personal. The trade war wasn't just about numbers, it was about livelihoods. As the dust settled, it was clear, the rules of global trade had changed. The American heartland would never be the same, and the world's economic map was being redrawn. To understand the trade war, we need to look back at the complex US-China economic relationship. For decades, American companies moved factories to China for cheap labor, while US consumers enjoyed low-cost goods. China became the world's factory, the US its biggest customer, creating a massive trade deficit. But this relationship had problems: currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, and accusations of unfair trade. Both Republican and Democratic presidents raised concerns, but tensions simmered. For American farmers, China was the customer, by 2017 buying nearly 60% of US soybean exports, worth over $14 billion. Generations of farmers built their livelihoods around Chinese demand. This deep dependence was also a vulnerability. When Trump imposed tariffs, he gambled that China needed US farm products too much to retaliate. It was a high-stakes bet, risking the livelihoods of American farmers. What many didn't realize, in a globalized world, no customer is irreplaceable. The foundation of rural prosperity was about to be shaken. The agricultural connection was more than business. It was survival. The trade war would test just how fragile these ties really were. As tariffs hit, the reality of global interdependence became painfully clear. The US learned that markets adapt quickly. The story of US-China trade is one of opportunity, risk, and hard lessons. The next chapter would be written in the fields of the Midwest, and the outcome would change global agriculture forever. The first shots of the trade war came in early 2018, US tariffs on steel, aluminum, and then a sweeping list of Chinese products. The message business as usual was over. China responded immediately, targeting US agriculture, especially soybeans, with 25% tariffs. This was a political and economic strike at Trump's rural base. Overnight, American soybeans became too expensive for Chinese buyers. Cargo ships stopped, and commodity prices crashed. For Midwest farmers, the crop they'd just planted was suddenly worth far less. Their biggest customer had vanished, with no replacement in sight. The tit-for-tat escalated: more tariffs, more retaliation, billions lost on both sides. The conflict spread beyond agriculture, hitting consumer and industrial goods. But for farmers, the first blow was the hardest. Decades of trade relationships unraveled in months. Financial security built over generations was now at risk. The trade war's front lines weren't in boardrooms, they were in rural America. Farmers became the first casualties, caught between two world powers. Their fate depended on negotiations far beyond their control. The economic pain was swift and deep. The trade war's impact would linger long after the headlines faded, and for many, recovery would be uncertain. For American farmers, the trade war was a daily struggle, not a political debate. Imagine planting thousands of acres only to watch prices collapse. "We're bleeding," one Ohio farmer said. "Our market's gone, our debt's growing." Many felt betrayed, promised protection, but left exposed. In 2017, US agricultural exports to China were $19.5 billion. By 2018, they'd fallen by more than half. Soybean exports collapsed from $12 billion to $3.10 billion, a catastrophe. Farm bankruptcies surged, and the emotional toll was immense. The pain rippled through small towns, dealerships, suppliers, diners all felt the pinch. "When farmers have a bad year, everyone has a bad year," said a Nebraska mayor. The trade war hollowed out rural economies, threatening a way of life. Farmers are resilient, but this was different, a man-made disaster. The uncertainty was crushing. Would the Chinese market ever return? The American dream on the farm felt like it was slipping away. Fields remained, but the future was blank. The crisis exposed the fragility of rural America. The trade war's scars ran deeper than dollars and cents. For many, hope was in short supply. The heartland was on the brink. As American farmers lost their biggest market, others seized the chance. China still needed soybeans and pork, so it turned to Brazil and Canada. Brazilian and Canadian ports boomed as U.S. grain elevators overflowed with unsold crops. Brazil ramped up soybean production, clearing land and enjoying record profits. Canada, with similar crops and climate, was a perfect fit for China's needs. Canadian soybean exports to China soared by over 80%. Canadian pork sales to China more than doubled in a year. The Canadian government worked to strengthen trade ties, fueling unprecedented prosperity for its farmers. The contrast was stark. American farmers faced ruin. Canadians expanded and thrived. Global markets are unforgiving. Loyalty is secondary to price and availability. China found new suppliers, and Canada captured market share built by Americans over decades. The question for U.S. farmers: would they ever win it back? The trade war redrew the agricultural map. Winners and losers were decided by policy, not productivity. For Canada and Brazil, it was a windfall. For the U.S., a painful lesson in global competition. The trade war's impact rippled far beyond the farm. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods raised costs for American companies and consumers. Prices for everyday items crept up, straining family budgets. Politically, the trade war divided even the president's own party. Rural support for Trump began to crack as economic pain deepened. The crisis widened the urban-rural divide, fueling frustration and isolation in small towns. Globally, supply chains were disrupted, slowing economic growth. America's reputation as a reliable trading partner suffered. Nations diversified partnerships to avoid future disputes. The world's economic map was being redrawn. The trade war's consequences were social, political, and global. Its effects would last long after the tariffs. As farm countries suffered, the Trump administration launched a massive aid program. Over 2 years, $28 billion in direct payments went to farmers, one of the largest bailouts in U.S. history. For many, the checks were a lifeline, keeping farms afloat. But the aid was a temporary fix, not a solution. It couldn't replace the lost Chinese market or restore long-term stability. Critics called it a band-aid on a bullet wound. The program sometimes favored larger farms, creating new inequalities. Ironically, tariffs meant to reduce government intervention led to unprecedented bailouts. The aid delayed but didn't solve the crisis. The challenge remained: how to rebuild trust and trade relationships. The checks could only postpone the reckoning. The future of American agriculture was still uncertain. When the dust settled, the trade war's winners and losers were clear. American farmers lost their top export market and relied on government aid to survive. Even after a new trade deal, the market never fully recovered. China had found new suppliers. U.S. consumers and manufacturers paid higher prices, and businesses faced disruptions. The goal of bringing jobs back often backfired, slowing economic growth. The biggest winners, Brazil and Canada, who gained market share and long-term contracts in China. Other countries like Vietnam and Mexico benefited as companies shifted operations. The trade war proved that aggressive tactics can backfire in a globalized world. Markets adapt, buyers find alternatives. The U.S. agricultural sector was dealt a severe blow, while competitors thrived. The lesson in global trade: no one is indispensable. The trade war left deep scars on American agriculture. The key lesson: trade relationships are fragile and hard to rebuild. The U.S. is not an indispensable supplier. Over-reliance on one market is risky. The future demands diversification, new markets, new products, and innovation. Investing in trade promotion and adapting to global demand is essential. Farmers and policymakers must work together to create new opportunities. The goal: resilience, not just recovery. Rebuilding trust at home and abroad is crucial. Smart, steady trade policies and long-term rural investment are needed. The challenges are real, but so is the resilience of American farmers. By learning from the past, the heartland can thrive again.